Today I have Rohini Srivathsa with me. She's a name that needs no introduction in India's tech space. As the National Technology Officer at Microsoft India, she's one of the prominent thought leaders with an illustrious career that span across numerous reputed organizations in India and across the globe. She's also an alumnus of the prestigious Wharton Business School. So, welcome to this post NTLF chat, Rohini. It's a pleasure to catch up with you again.
Thank you, Jibu. Good to talk to you.
So Rohini, you are, I think, in my previous conversations with you and other writings of you, other opinions you shared, you are a firm proponent of the responsible AI, and Microsoft is one of the organizations that is leading the responsible AI principles. Came with the responsible AI principles. So now we are in a phase where we are moving beyond the principles. We will talk about mostly the deployment part. So how do we ensure that the AI tools that's deployed in across country or across globe meet these responsible AI principles?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jibu. And definitely, it's a topic that is of great interest to many of us in the industry. And I think it's increasingly getting the importance and focus that it deserves. Before I get into uh, the mechanics of how to take responsibility forward, let me step back a little bit and talk about why is this a topic that we should be paying attention to. Um, you know, as technology is becoming more and more pervasive, and we know about um, the NASSCOM the discussion about this being a decade. We know that the world is becoming more and more technologically intensive. Satya uses the word tech intensity. As the tools are getting more powerful, as the benefit that can be obtained from the tools, the damage, the downside is also equally there. So technological innovation, one has to make sure that it is not just a question of what technology can do, but whether it should do something. So that's the question. I think um, AI is a general purpose technology, which means it has impact at a much broader socio-economic, cultural dimensions. And therefore, uh, as we look at AI getting more and more ubiquitous, more and more embedded into the technologies we use, the services we use, and even in a way that you don't realize you're using AI, but you are. It is important that we ensure that it is following certain principles of overall ethics and fairness, etc. But I would generally call them as responsible AI principles rather than bringing in ethical aspects into it. So that's that, and that's the whole reason for thinking about responsible AI. Now, it's a topic that Microsoft has been thinking about for quite some time. And 2016 is the first time where Satya wrote an article which introduced the concepts of responsible AI. And from there, we've come a long way. Um, and to your question about it takes more than principles, right? And that's absolutely right. I think the importance of principles is, first of all, that it brings everybody to the same page as to what is it we are talking about. What is it do we care about? For example, when we look at the principle of fairness and we ask each other the question as an organization, for example, as an HR leader, do you think our hiring practices are fair? It's a very fundamental question. It's actually not a technology question at all. Um, let's similarly, for example, we say our workplace is inclusive. It's a fundamental cultural question. It's a human question. It is not a technology question at all. When those conversations are held in a leadership room, in a boardroom, in an organization at various levels, you're asking some very fundamental human values questions. Then the question comes, okay, if we agree on these as the primary human values, what will it take to now ensure that as machines, as AI is doing many of the decisions which earlier humans only took? But today, if AI is taking many of those decisions, then how do we ensure that if you and I agree that these will be the core principles by which we will operate, that the machines will also follow the same principles? Right? So I think the very first thing that it does is it makes you have a discussion about principles. Right? Now to get to your question about how do you ensure that they're getting implemented? That's a very, very useful question. And the short answer I would give you right now, we can have a further conversation on that, is that its implementation is everybody concerned coming to the same page and putting those principles into practice at scale. What does that take? That takes a combination of technology tools, but that's not enough. In fact, I would say that comes much later. What comes earlier than that are a bunch of practices, which means guidelines and checklists and data sets and training and people's understanding and awareness, all of those practices, before you can say that I am actually taking anything into implementation. Then on top of that, you bring in tools which come in. Of course, tools are an area that is being researched on, and there are a bunch of tools out there. And it's an area of continuous research. And then finally, governance. So I would say it becomes a question about principles, agreeing on them, understanding them, and really thoughtfully defining them, and then taking them into practice through a range of practices and trainings, tools, and governance. So it really is a full program, if I put it that way, and really a thinking, a paradigm when you look at taking responsible AI into implementation.
It's not like an easy solution as we speak about other industries and other sector. I mean, there is a lot of complex entities involved when it comes to AI. And the follow-up question I want to ask is: you mentioned about the fairness, right? The human side of the workplaces, right? His hiring is fair. The other decisions we make in our offices and our lives are fair. And one big issue we have seen is we tend to see these AI algorithms, AI models acting very biased. And for example, you look at what happened in US with the Compass algorithm, which was used for parole allocation, and the algorithm continuously judged in favor of white men rather than and it was very how do I say partial against the people from black community. Now these historical biases, the biases we human have, right? And now we are seeing our own reflections, our own biases are reflected in this AI models, and as biases. So, what are your thoughts on how can we overcome this human error part? The human biases in AI. What can we do about it?
Yeah, so I think good question. I think fairness and bias is, I would claim, one of these responsible AI principles. And if I were to just lay them all out before I get into the fairness part, we have to think of all of them, because every AI use case, every scenario, there are two or three, if not more, of these principles which become the main areas of focus that one needs to put into mind. So I don't want to just say it's all just about fairness. And let me just lay them out. Fairness is one, security and privacy, safety and reliability, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. At least these are the six principles that Microsoft has been thinking about. And I think if I look at all my industry peers, and if you look at Niti Aayog's overall responsible AI framework, there's broad concurrence. There may be a little bit words here and there, but it's a reasonably mutually exclusive, cumulatively exhaustive kind of framework, right? Now, because the reason I say that is because it's important to remember that different AI use cases, the principles as a holistic framework has to be thought about as to which principles are getting violated. Right. Now, let me come to the point about fairness and bias, as you mentioned. And of course, fairness and bias is a very key principle, one of the responsible AI principles, and comes into play, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of the role you mentioned. It comes in hiring, it comes in all kinds of practices, right? So as you said, to my earlier point, if I start to ask a question openly, do you think we make fair decisions always?
Oh, no.
Right? I think that is a very important question a leadership team, an organization, a non-profit, a government, first of all, has to face with honesty. That how are we being fair? Leave the machines out of the picture, right? How are we ensuring that we are fair? Because then you have the ability to then think through how will you ensure that the machines who are then making certain decisions on our behalf or augmenting our decisions, how can they be fair, right? Because what the machines are doing, for example, in the example you gave, it's primarily mimicking past behavior.
Hmm. Past
It
human
is
behavior.
past human, exactly. It's mimicking past human behavior, which was biased and is biased. Human beings are biased. We have unconscious biases. We all should be aware of it, right? So the question is that are the machines doing something wrong? No, I would argue that we have not asked ourselves the tough questions about fairness and bias that we are now realizing that machines are just mimicking.
Mhm.
Okay, so therefore it goes back into the question about saying, what are my principles? Am I really ready to have a completely unbiased and fair system? Okay, so that's a hard conversation. That's a hard conversation. But having said that, let us say we agree that yes, hiring should be fair and unbiased, and we need to make sure. Now the question is that what have the machines done in terms of being able to incorporate bias into it? That comes from training data. At least one of the ways comes from training data, right? So, as I was earlier saying, various parts of responsible AI are active areas of research across the world. Privacy, confidential computing, it's a very, very active causal analysis. Very similarly for fairness, there are some tools out there which look at the data set and can give you a sense for what the level of bias that is inherent in that data set. Okay, but I would not say it's these tools, and one should use many of them. I wouldn't say that these tools are today the be all or end all. I mean, they are good tools, but they are evolving. There is no, there is no alternative for
Hmm.
regular continuous testing. You can't just create a machine learning system and sort of say it is out there in production. You need to continuously test and be aware, because there will be bias around certain dimensions. Let's say sexual identification dimension, right? You may not even have realized what is the bias that has been incorporated. So there's continuous testing required. Then there's, of course, data quality of data is important, and then there are tools, as I was mentioning, which are able to give you some indication in terms of inherent bias in the data.
So one question I want, you mentioned the six fundamental responsible AI principle, and I'm just trying to reiterate what I understood. So these
Mhm.
principles are not equally applicable in all use cases, right? They will vary the level of importance. For example, let's look at something like facial recognition. So if
Mhm.
it's a, let's say, surveillance system, the principles like fairness and accountability might be more, security might be more valuable there, but at the same time, we use facial recognition of a phone, but there you don't need that kind of principles, right? So I'm just trying to figure out, so these six principles are not equally applicable, but it varies, right, depending on the scenario.
Yeah, exactly. And so let me give an example um, to kind of show you the sort of variation, right? So let us say you're on a shopping website and you click on some things and it shows you some more thing that you may want to buy. I mean, you may be interested as to why it's selling you these things, but you will be, "Oh, okay, fine. It looks interesting, I'll buy it," right? Or you may not buy it. However, you go to a doctor and the doctor says, Jibu, in the next 12 months, not going to happen, but you're going to face this health problem or whatever. What's your first question going to be? Why?
Yeah.
How can you say that? On what basis? Right? So in the first example, you really don't, I mean, it's of some casual interest as to why the algorithm is telling you to buy this. In the second one, it's the most important question,
Mhm.
right? So that's the principle of transparency or explainability.
Right.
So in some cases, like the example I gave, that principle is probably the most important principle that you want to be able to a medical, diagnostic tool to be able to say why it is saying what it is saying, right?
Right.
Similarly, let's get a separate example. You talked about facial recognition. Facial recognition is, of course, a technology, a capability, let me put it this way, that can be used in many use cases. But let us say it is used in, for example, at a shopping center to help people provide better services to somebody who comes into a store. Okay. Now, one could say it is trying to do better customer service, but it was potentially an invasion of privacy.
Right.
Right. So here is an example of something that could be used, for example, for great convenience in terms of marketing, etc. But could potentially also have a privacy concern in case somebody doesn't want to be identified, or is it's not a notification saying out there that one needs to maintain privacy. So what I mean to say is that every AI use case, to some extent, all of these principles are relevant in all UI use, but there are typically for a particular AI use case, 2 or 3 of these have become the really red flags that you are trying to start thinking about.
Right. So now let's come back to India. No, not come back. We'll come back to look at India from an AI point of view. And you mentioned the decade. The Prime Minister was speaking very optimistically about the looking at the number of startups that have came across in the last few years in India. And then I think the latest AI index from Stanford also rates India quite highly. We lead in skilling. We lead in we are fourth in academic papers published, and interestingly, we in the skilling part we have more women now being skilled than men out of all the countries they survived. So that's a good news, and kudos to inspirational role played by people like you, Dev Jani, and many others in the industry. And now coming to India, we always speak about how India has taken a different approach on AI. A more AI for all, AI for social good approach. But at the same time, when we look from a larger perspective, what are the gaps and challenges we need to overcome, let's say in the next 10 years or in the 5 years, so that we can, become a bigger beneficiary of this AI wave?
Yeah, so I think definitely India has an advantage from, as you mentioned, from a skills perspective, but I would still argue there is room for us to do better.
Right.
But I would say that the 3 main areas that India should pay attention to as we are looking to leverage AI for the country, and in a way that allows for us to ensure that we are growing inclusively. There is a valid challenge of technology becoming a divider, a digital divide, and those concerns are very valid. So in India, we have to be very, very cognizant of ensuring that the growth we go after is inclusive. So I would say there are 3. I think one is the whole democratization of AI. When I say democratization, I'm looking at not just people who create AI, but also people who are using AI, meaning AI as a augmented tool for, let's say, health workers. So how can you ensure that people are trained in a way that, for example, a diagnostic tool is able to, let's say, early signs of blindness, early signs of diabetic retinopathy, right? If that can be, for example, diagnosed by people in the field using an AI-enabled tool, that then reduces the stresses on specialists who need to see people for the basic diagnosis. And if they can see only people who have genuine concerns, then that we have been able to do some kind of a democratization. So I think the democratization of AI as from a creation of technology perspective, which means AI as a service, which means AI from a low code, no code perspective, the entire gamut of using cognitive services which are available today for use by developers, not just data scientists. So democratization is a bigger thematic, I think, is an important aspect that we need to think about AI for the country. The second one is what we were talking about is responsible AI. And responsible AI is important because the principles, the 6 principles that I laid out earlier of fairness, of inclusion, reliability and safety, security and privacy, of transparency and accountability, these are very fundamental. And if we are able to build AI with these responsible AI principles as the fundamental building block, then I think we have a really good shot at leveraging AI for India at scale. And the third is, of course, on skills. And I think you are right on the Stanford Index bringing out skills India being high. But I think AI is not one sort of not one lump, right? There is algorithms, that's domain knowledge, there is engineering and technology, and I kind of look at that as a tripartite in terms of being able to successfully apply AI. So people have to become both breadth and depth in these areas. And AI by itself as a technology is evolving. So the number of people who are able to really develop products using AI, really have a product management and that acumen is also important. So it's not just AI technical certification type of skills, which can be a little bit narrow in respect. So I think we have some ways to go. Of course, there's a many um, initiatives that NASSCOM is doing, that we are partnering with NASSCOM on. We've been working with governments as well as with academic institutions in terms of AI digital labs, as well as with CBSC on including AI as in the K-12 education system. Similarly, we have been working with Digital India from a perspective of in terms of digital governance tour. So I think there's a lot of work that's happening there. Um, but I think clearly that's an area which is of strength to India, but we need to also make sure that we are building across the entire gamut of AI to be able to really be credibly that talent hub for the world.
One of the key points you mentioned is that our the need to bridge that digital divide, right? How do we ensure that AI will act as a force to uplift people, the bottom part of the pyramid. And Microsoft is one organization that has been doing some phenomenal work, whether it's about AI for social good or AI for climate change, even AI for archaeological preservation. So many works has been coming from Microsoft from a research standpoint of view that is aimed for a general, what, how do you say, global or common good in that sense. One key barrier that we face as a country is the language barrier. In a way, we are very proud to have hundreds of local languages and 22 official languages. At the same time, when we live in a period of in a joint economy and a lot of transactions, it can be an issue. And Microsoft has been a pioneer when it comes to addressing these vernacular language challenges. And I think in the last few years, Microsoft has been doing some phenomenal work in NLP, and especially from an accessibility standpoint of view, so which I will uh, come as a second part. So, can you give an overview on how Microsoft is like leveraging these NLP AI technologies for addressing this language barrier?
Yeah. I think language, as you very rightly mentioned, Jibu, is the medium through which the common person accesses information, opportunity, and of course communication, right? And communication, of course, is the first thing that you and I are doing in English right now. But if a common person needs to access any kind of information, opportunity, the language is the first. But having said that, beyond language, now that the technology is becoming mature in areas of speech to text and text to speech, being able to interface with technology without the need to type, without the need for being literate. Even that can be, overcome, because many of these technologies from a text to speech to text is becoming mature. But coming to your point about language, there's a translation. So look, globally, Microsoft is supporting more than 100 languages that can get translated. Really obscure languages across the world. Even languages that are, things like Swahili or Mayan and Maori. Some of these languages which are, you and I don't talk about as much, but I think what is happening is there are technologies improving in terms of that are able to use both low resource languages and use certain techniques to either augment data or use the language's own internal structure to be able to create those language models. Um, but now I think if you come to India right now, some 11 Indian languages can get translated. There's transliteration possible with 9 languages. But having said that, I think it's not just about the translation, but the ability um, to have this voice interface conversations, which is then allows people to be able to have this easy interface with technology. Now, coming to the point about low resource languages, as you know, the government has a national language translation mission that we are also contributing in various ways. That is intended to help address this language divide in the country, because there are many languages, as you rightly said, which are low resource languages, and which is where some of the technology I was earlier alluding to comes into picture in terms of being able to leverage the internal structure of languages as well as other techniques to be able to close that divide. Similarly, one of the things that is happening right now is a program that we are engaging with IIT Madras on sign language, because India's sign language is also different from what is used in other parts of the world, because certain terms that are relevant in India are not very relevant in other parts of the world. So that is another area where we are partnering with IIT Madras in terms of using visual and of course the different techniques to be able to create sign language which is India specific.
It's a great initiative to help people who are differently challenged through with sign languages. And I think Microsoft has been doing so many interesting work to help disabled people, especially AI for accessibility. Before we wind up, I have one last question. And what are the new initiatives? What are the things that's happening with regard to AI in Microsoft that's exciting you these days? What are the things we should look forward to?
I think that's a very long conversation we can have, but
Thought
uh,
of it would be useful.
yeah. I'm very excited about the concept of making, while there are big technological advancements happening, I think the organization's continuous focus on making that technology available to developers, making the technology available at scale is, I think, to me very, very exciting, because the impact and the scale at which AI can really change the game is so vast that if you kept that hidden away with a small group of people, data scientists, machine learning folks, then you will not be able to do the kind of justice that is possible. So what I mean by that is things like the GPT-3, large language models available today on Azure as a cognitive service. Right now, that is democratization of AI, because now it is available for somebody to be able to build new capabilities using AI as a service. So that's one area I'm very, very excited about. The second area I would say is this huge, what we've been talking about is the whole responsible AI world, because any of these technologies, as they move forward, their ability to make an impact has to bring responsibility as part of the design principle, not as an afterthought. And that being a huge focus for Microsoft is an area of great excitement to me. Finally, I think the some of the advantage, initiatives that are happening today in the world of autonomous systems is also an area that one should watch out for, because clearly, for many use cases, even though India is a different market from perspective of people, etc. But there are many situations where, for example, disaster recovery, for example, unsafe areas, mines, etc., where you need to have autonomous systems, and that is another area of AI with reinforcement learning and other technologies that are becoming very, very exciting. So yeah, quite excited about a whole range of topics.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear the new initiatives that's being under work at Microsoft, and I know the whole Azure itself is a long conversation about the things the impact it has made as well. So thank you very much, Rohini, for this lovely conversation. It was very informative and insightful as always, and looking forward to catching up with you soon.
Thank you, Jibu. Really appreciate it.